The educator has a very complex role in promoting positive relationships between children. So one way that we do this is by designing a physical and also an emotional environment for children to feel safe, to engage in positive peer relationships.
When you have an educator responsible for groups of children, there are lots of relationships in play. You've got the relationship between the educators, you've got the relationship between the educators and the children, and you've got the relationship between the children and the children. And the way in which each of those relationships happen also influence how other relationships happen with other people. So I think it's really important for educators to understand how relationships are developed and how they're enacted so that they're more attuned to children and how they are with children.
You know, in BU we have a very good terminology for how we see early years services. For us, they are learning communities. And then we talk about what we call the whole service approach. It starts with the individual child at the center, but outside them are the learning environment and the educators that are in it. It talks about their community, and it also talks about their broader community. Now, those relationships are layered in the way that they all affect this child. And unless an educator is positioned well with the right knowledge, with the right skills, it's easy to miss the opportunities in those relationships.
At our preschool, we do unpack all events with children as well as educators to express how they're feeling. And that's something that, small children can find difficult, but it's about educators also reading body language as well as the mood, looking at what's happened before, what's happened after, and working with that child to help unpack how they're feeling, what does it look like, what does it sound like, and what does it feel like for that child.
We deliberately interact with children to support them in their social and emotional learning in many different ways. These include our conversations with them throughout the day. We encourage them to acknowledge their feelings, and we also help particularly younger children, help them to identify their feelings and label them.
BU has a whole domain on resilience. And in that domain, the content of that domain is intended to build educators' capacity to support children's social and emotional learning. Now, social and emotional learning goes beyond just teaching children to do. You need those relationships with the children to be there. You need trusting relationships.
Sometimes we talk about managing children's behaviour, and in my way I really like to say understanding children's behaviour. And so professional development should have opportunities for educators to come together so that they have a deeper understanding of what children's behaviours are and how they then can fit into the lives of children, rather than talking about managing children's behaviour. Because if we manage children's behaviour, we don't actually give them opportunities to be risk takers and to develop that sense of agency.
When we are doing the activities, we try our best to communicate with the children. So communication is one of the headlines coming up under the My Time, Our Place framework. As an effective communicators, what we do is we just try to build up that conversation. Why we are doing that? What's the reason? Why you like to make this card for your friend? Has she done something for you? Or that little thing, so it reminds the purpose of making that simple card or something like that. So little things like that. Every week we do activities. We call that BU activities.
An educator who's engaged in BU will also know that relationships with their peers is also a protective factor. So when they experience positive relationships with their peers, that can act to protect them against the sort of buffer against risk factors. So if a child isn't experiencing positive relationships with peers, educators who've engaged in BU know that that is an opportunity to help support that.
Everything a child says has meaning, and it's sort of really being there and present with the child and respecting what their voice is to really work on that relationship. And the same goes for your fellow educators, is that everybody within our service has something to bring and something to offer. I would definitely say that the communication and mental health centric aspects of BU have really helped in assisting our children and sort of teaching children from a very young age what it is to recognise the differences in emotions between, you know, their peers and even the educators, because, you know, educators are human too.
Educators' knowledge of children's mental health can help to develop secure relationships between children and between adults and children.
So in BU, educators and whole of learning services will learn that positive relationships with children are a protective factor for their mental health. So even though we've understood for some time that relationships are the core of our work in early childhood education, BU helps you think about that through a mental health lens.